Joanna Bard Newton died just before her 103rd birthday. She was too modest to write her autobiography, so this is a brief account of a remarkable woman in honor of what would have been her 105th year. Born at St. John's Hospital in Oxnard, she was the first child of Joan Boyd Bard and Richard Bard. Her father missed the birth as he was in France serving in the U.S. artillery in World War I. She was delivered by Dr. R.G. Livingston, whose medical studies had been funded by her grandfather, Thomas R. Bard. She was born during the influenza epidemic, which she and her mother survived. Perhaps that brush with death contributed to her cheerful spirit and honest gratitude for every day. Jana was raised on her grandfather's coastal farm in Hueneme. Following their marriage in 1916, her parents moved into a rustic redwood cottage in the shadow of Richard's parents' large formal home, built by architect Myron Hunt in 1912 in a style similar to his design for the Huntington home in San Marino. Her grandparents' farm, called Barrelwood in honor of their daughter Beryl, included a dairy, nearby crops of lima beans, and a botanic garden of rare plants. In 1871, her grandfather built a wharf at Hueneme for agricultural shipping before the railroad had been built, and ship captains would bring him seeds from around the world. After her father Richard returned from World War I, her earliest memory of him was holding her and mimicking the sound of the foghorn on the nearby lighthouse.
Ooh, 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 and Dad said, foghorn, foghorn.
After a second story was added to the bungalow, she first slept in a bedroom next to her parents, and then moved to a room down the hall. Her grandfather Thomas died 2 years before she was born, but her grandmother Mary lived until 1936, 1 year after Jana had gone to Vassar. After the death of Thomas in 1915, Mary found little use for the big house and the Hueneme fog, so she escaped to a home in Ojai or the Potter Hotel in Santa Barbara. As a child, Jana was photographed in front of the big house reading a book. Every Sunday night, she and her parents were invited to dine with Mary, where they were served by her Chinese cook, Su Hu Su. She described the environment as formal. Her spinster Aunt Beryl presumably attended those dinners as her mother's companion. Jana had mixed feelings about growing up in Hueneme. Her father had been born in the 3-story Victorian home that Thomas built in the 1890s, so was accustomed to the ranch. Her grandmother Mary was raised in San Francisco and missed the cosmopolitan life. So did her close friend in Hueneme, Julia Levy, who was raised in Paris. To escape the fog, Mary stayed at the Ojai Valley Inn and then bought a home there, although Jana did not mention visiting her. Her aunts, Kitty and Beryl, owned homes in Ojai, presumably to get away from the fog. She had happy memories of holidays at the bungalow, where her mother played the Steinway baby grand piano her parents gave her in 1914, the same model given to her cousin and best friend, Camilla Waterman Austin. Joan's parents were frequent visitors at the bungalow. A photo of Jana taken when she was about 2 shows her on Hueneme Beach with her German governess, Joanna. It is possible that it was Mary's idea to bring Joanna from Germany, as her parents had immigrated from Bremen to San Francisco in 1850. Mary's brothers, Albert and Otto, lived in Hueneme where they worked for Thomas. Jana did not care for her governess, saying she was overly strict. She adored Miss Malden, the British-born, Cambridge-educated governess to Joan's father and his siblings. She lived in an upstairs room in the big house, not far from Thomas and Mary's separate bedrooms. Jana fondly recalled Miss Malden teaching her the alphabet as they sat on Miss Malden's bed. She never married and is buried next to Thomas and Mary. Joanna recalls that Thomas had a large collection of Chumash baskets displayed on top of cabinets in the upstairs hallway of their home. They were probably given to him by his brother Cephas, who opened the first medical office in the Ventura Mission circa 1868. His first patients were Chumash, whom he befriended. Cephas married Mary's sister Clara Gerberding, but when they divorced, Mary banned him from their home. It pained Joanna to think that Thomas had to secretly meet with his brother in Ventura. After Thomas died, Mary gave the baskets to the Hueneme Women's Improvement Club, which she had founded, perhaps to purge memories of Cephas. Thomas sponsored the construction of a Presbyterian church at Hueneme. As Mary remained Episcopalian, they hired architect Arthur Burnett Benton to build a modest redwood church in Hueneme. Joanna was the last person to be baptized at that site. There were not enough parishioners to keep it going, and Joanna recalled visiting the empty church as a child and ringing the bell. The church was moved to Fillmore and is active today. When her brothers Dick and Archie were born, they enjoyed playing in their grandfather's botanic garden. As a young girl, she rode her horse Peggy across the Hueneme Slough to the sand dunes at Hueneme Beach, where her grandmother Mary recalled finding abundant Chumash shell wampum. A nearby artesian well was the site where Chumash prepared their wooden boats for voyage to the Channel Islands and named the place Hueneme, or resting place, echoing the pronunciation of her grandmother. The Bard Cottage, or the bungalow as they called it, and the big house were at the end of a long dirt road, lined with eucalyptus trees as a windbreak, many exotic trees and climbing roses named Beauty of Barrelwood, bred by her grandfather Thomas. A wooden gate separated the entrance from nearby Ventura Avenue. Joanna's close friend Josephine Sullivan often came to play in the garden with her. Many of her classmates at the Hueneme Grammar School were children whose parents had fled the Midwest during drought and wind, known as the Dust Bowl. Drawn to Hueneme for work, some of these parents were not able to buy shoes for their children. Joanna and her siblings were aware of the needs of their classmates and embarrassed that they were brought to school by a driver. Joanna's brother Archie maintained a close, lifelong relationship with classmate Jimmy Haycox.
Every Sunday, Dad took us somewhere new. And the first one I remember, down the little town of Hueneme, and then out over some, lagoons to the lighthouse. And there was a little patch of dirt and garden around it, and there were sheep feeding off that. And we went into the lighthouse, and Dad knew the lighthouse keeper, and we walked up some stairs to look at the Fresnel, Fresnel light, which was magnificent. Went round and round.
A favorite memory was when she was driven over the San Marcos Pass, where her mother took the stagecoach as a child to the olive ranch of her grandparents, Alden and Margaret Boyd, on the Alamo Pintado. She adored them, as can be seen when she was a year old, sitting on her grandmother's lap in a photo by the Gledhills. At that time, her mother said that there were no fences in the Santa Ynez Valley. Her parents met on a camping trip at Davy Brown's cabin, where Richard was a last-minute substitution for David Myrick. Joan kept a painting of Figueroa Mountain near her as a tribute to their meeting. When she was 12, Joanna sneaked out of the house one evening and went for a ride in a car with some local teenage friends. This upset her parents and may have contributed to her being sent to board at the Santa Barbara Girls' School, 1931 to 1935. Although she missed her parents and siblings, she spoke of the school as a place that opened new doors and friendships. The school was located near the Santa Barbara Mission, and she spent weekends with her grandparents, who had moved from Los Olivos to a home on Garden Street. Joanna spoke with pride at having won the Harvey Heffelfinger track trophy and excelled at all sports. The school head, Gertrude Grogan, had written a book about important women in the United States when she taught history at Vassar College. Joanna's mother had wanted her to attend Smith College, but Joan's friend, Elizabeth DeForest, wife of Santa Barbara landscape architect Lockwood DeForest Jr., said that Vassar would be okay. From 1935 to 1939, Joanna majored in history at Vassar. Her roommate was Claire Gates, whose father taught classics at Harvard. They would remain lifelong friends. Vassar inspired her interest in history and writing, which would continue throughout her life. During her years at Vassar, Richard was planning to build a harbor at Hueneme on land he had bought, known as the Slough. In 1939, Margaret was with Richard when he dug the first ceremonial shovel of dirt for the harbor. Archie and Dick boarded at Thatcher School circa 1936 to 40, around the time Kitty attended Connecticut College. After Thatcher, Archie attended Princeton for 2 years before he joined the Air Force. During World War II, he flew transport planes in the treacherous weather of the Aleutian Islands, which Japanese forces attacked. After the war, he attended UC Berkeley, where he met his wife, Carla Henney. Dick attended Cornell and also served as a pilot in the Air Force during World War II in the U.S. After graduating from Vassar in the summer of 1939, Joanna and a Vassar friend rode bicycles through Scotland, while Kitty studied painting in Paris at the Académie Julienne. When Germany invaded Poland that September, Richard told Joanna to find Kitty and get to a ship where he had booked passage for them to New York. Their ship went several hundred miles out of the way one night to rescue the crew of a British ship which had been torpedoed by a Nazi sub. Joanna recalled the faces of the wet but thankful men as they climbed aboard. She returned to New York to work for IBM, demonstrating their new accounting machines at the 1939 World's Fair. She was surrounded by modernist architecture and innovative displays of the latest technology. New to city living, Manhattan also exposed its dark side. Once while walking through a narrow passage leading to the stairs to her apartment, a man grabbed her. When she screamed at the top of her lungs, he finally released her. She was brave and very strong-willed. Richard's Hueneme Harbor was inaugurated in 1940. Joanna missed that event as she was working in New York, but she had returned home for Christmas when Pearl Harbor was bombed on December 7, 1941. She and Margie recall that the next day, civil defense troops arrived and set up machine gun nests around the harbor. The Navy laid a steel net at the entrance to the harbor, as there were rumored sightings of Japanese subs in the channel. Joanna returned to New York. In 1942, her Vassar classmate Claire Gates asked her to serve as maid of honor at her wedding in Cambridge, Massachusetts. The groom, Dave Gates, asked Trav Newton to serve as best man. During the wedding rehearsal, as they walked down the aisle, Trav whispered unknown teasing into her ear. She said, "If you don't stop, I will stab you with my hat pin." She was smitten by his wit. Trav was enlisted in the Army, so we think Joanna traveled to Fort Bragg, North Carolina to meet him. After 2 weeks they were engaged and soon married at St. George's Church in Manhattan. Joanna's parents, brother Dick, girls' school classmate Jane Rich attended. For their brief honeymoon, Joanna booked a room in the historic White Hart Inn in Salisbury, Connecticut, where the railroad ended, after boarding in Grand Central Station. By 1943, Joanna was pregnant. She was living with Trav at Fort Bragg, but didn't want their child to be born in an Army hospital. In late May or early June, she traveled alone to Baltimore, Maryland, where her uncle, Dr. Philip Bard, was head of the physiology department at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. Dr. Bard arranged for a Dr. Eastman, an OB-GYN, to deliver Jana's baby. On June 10th, 1944, she gave birth to daughter Joanna, nicknamed Josie. Because she wanted to rejoin Trav at Fort Bragg before he was sent off to war, she arranged for her mother and younger sister Margie to travel to Baltimore from Hueneme to pick Josie up when she was 6 weeks old. They brought her by train back to Jones' cottage in Hueneme. Jana would return to Josie in November when Trav left for Germany. Jana was asleep with Trav in married officers' quarters when she heard marching troops outside their window before dawn. A knock on the door and the order, "Newton, fall out." Trav shipped out in November 1944. He served as a combat artillery forward observer and was one of 600,000 GIs who fought on the Western Front in Germany in the Battle of the Bulge. The battle raged between December 16, 1944 and January 25, 1945. Trav received the Bronze Star for valor. He remained overseas, writing for the newspaper Stars and Stripes, and contemplated a possible career in the military. However, he returned to California and his wife and daughter in 1946. He and Jana and Josie lived briefly in a small Navy cottage in Hueneme until he found work at a wholesale produce company in downtown Los Angeles. They found a modest bungalow to rent in West Hollywood on a street called Norma Place. In 1947, while living at Norma Place, Jana and Trav welcomed their second daughter, Georgia, into their lives. She was named after Trav's mother, Georgiana Travers. 2 years later, the family moved to a slightly larger home in West Los Angeles. It was set in a rustic canyon called Beverly Glen, nestled between Sunset Boulevard and Mulholland Drive. Their street was named Chrysanthemum Lane. Beverly Glen Canyon was an interesting and stimulating environment for Joanna and Trav. Many of the people who lived there were teachers, artists, writers, beatniks, and some lesser-known movie people. In 1950, their third child, Henry Travers Jr., was born. Their family was now complete. During those early years, Jana enrolled her young children in the locally run preschool called Playgroup. This is where Jana and Trav became friends with many of the children's parents. Jana and Trav's children loved growing up in Beverly Glen. They had great fun exploring the leafy hillsides, hiking, climbing trees, and building forts. Jana became involved in this unique community, getting to know the residents and volunteering when needed. Because she was someone who had great empathy for others, there were times when she would help out neighbors who were going through hard times by donating food or clothing. Jana's children remember her as a loving, nurturing, and devoted mother. Their happiness was her focus above everything else. In the early 1970s, after her children were grown and on their own, Jana decided she wanted to research and write about the genealogy of her mother's family, the Boyds. Her book, The Boyds of Albany, was published in 1972. The book traces several generations of Boyds, originally from Scotland, from Albany, New York, to California. There was even a branch of Boyds who became both missionaries and one trusted assistant to Queen Liliuokalani in Hawaii. After 34 idyllic years in Beverly Glen Canyon, the empty nesters Jana and Trav moved to Santa Barbara, buying Joan Bard's property when she moved to a retirement home. Trav became a member of the acquisition board of the Santa Barbara Museum of Art and was very involved, and Jana began to fulfill her passion in continuing to research and write about her family's deep roots in Ventura and Santa Barbara counties. She was a member of the Ventura Museum and a trustee of the Santa Barbara Historical Museum. She researched the Thomas Bard Archive at the Huntington Library given by her father. In 1965, W. H. Hutchinson published the 2-volume book Oil, Land, and Politics. In the early 1990s, Carolyn Nash, wife of Commanding Officer David Nash, began a group called the Friends of the Bard Mansion. A core group of Navy wives joined Carolyn, and they cataloged the Bard archive given to the Friends by Thomas Bard's daughter, Elizabeth Bard Shand. Jana joined the Friends of the Bard in 1992. Many Friends of the Bard members faithfully supported the organization until the unfortunate turn of world events shut access to the mansion down. Jana and daughter Georgia wrote newsletters for the Friends. Jana happily reconnected with Wenatchee friends like Bill and Jeanette Miranda, Dorothy Ramirez, Orvine Carpenter, and Eddie Chavez, whom she knew as a child. Eddie grew up at Barrelwood, where his father was head gardener. Jana's grandmother, Mary Bard, taught her the botanical names of the trees and shrubs in the garden. She worked hard to try and find a way to work with the Navy to restore the north court of the mansion. Restoring this part of the garden became a goal of hers. Lori Hanna, librarian at the Santa Barbara Botanic Garden, mapped and cataloged the remaining trees and shrubs surrounding the big house, as the Bard family called it, and wrote about the garden in a journal published by the Ventura County Museum. In 2005, Powell Greenland, Western historian and author of Ventura County's Maritime Legacy, published A Troubled Dream, Richard Bard's struggle to build a harbor at Wenatchee, California. Powell's great respect for Jana's father and his determination through unbelievable resistance from both the federal and local governments comes through in his detailed account. Thanks go to Jess Herrera for his support and the funding from the Oxnard Harbor District for this. Thanks also to Julia Brownlee, Kathy Long, John Zaragoza, and Kelly Long, all longtime supporters of the Friends of the Bard. And special thanks to Captain Bob Quinn for shepherding this group through the maze of regulations so that we may bring this memorial for Jana back to her home. In the 1990s, Jana and her sister Kitty published a book of drawings in watercolors by their maternal great-aunt, Margaret Boyd Bush. Margaret made these works during the years 1883 to 1887 when she came by train from Albany, New York, to live with her brother Alden in Los Olivos. Jana housed the Bard and Boyd archive in her home and began writing a book based on grandfather Alden's diary. Alden started an olive ranch in Los Olivos, after which the town was named. He was also a Santa Barbara County supervisor. In 2018, Jana presented the book Finding Los Olivos at the Santa Ynez Historical Society, where we hope to have an exhibit of the Margaret Bush drawings and watercolors. Josie, Georgie, and Trav Jr. are so very fortunate to have had their dear mother as a truly angelic guide throughout her almost 103 years. At the time of her passing, she adored her 2 grandchildren, Gia and River, and great-granddaughter Gabby. We all feel her kind and loving spirit every day.
Yes, you'll be surprised, but I do. I believe God made the universe and gave them a life expectancy, and then when they're gone, I think their souls rejoin him in a unspecified place called heaven.
With her kind and gentle spirit and deep appreciation for her father and grandfather's far-reaching contributions, We echo Joanna's insistence that we honor and never forget the legacies of these humble pioneers of American ingenuity and accomplishments.